Hello, everyone. Welcome to this workshop, which is entitled Preparing Poetry for Submission to the Mairtín Crawford Award 2025. I'm Kathleen McCracken, and it's a pleasure to be here with fellow poet and judge Don Watson. I'm going to say a few words to begin with about how the workshop will be structured, what we'll be covering in the next 90 minutes. I'm going to kick off by talking a bit about the background to the award. Um, and then Don will come in and talk about practicalities, how you go about submitting, how to prepare your work. And then together, we're going to discuss some key areas, things like eligibility, submission criteria, advice on how to submit, what the judges are looking for, what some of the common errors are. At the end of the session, we would invite you as participants to submit questions into the chat, and we will address these in the last 20 or so minutes of the session. So I'll invite Dawn now to say a little bit about herself, and I'll come back, say a little bit about myself, and then we'll get into the session proper. Dawn, do you want to
Hi,
introduce?
thanks, Kathleen. Hello, everyone. Yeah, my name's Dawn Watson, and I'm a poet from Belfast. I live in Belfast at the minute. And my first book, We Play Here, was published in 2023. And I'm working on my second. I'm also a teacher. I'm a lecturer at Queen's University, and I teach poetry and creative writing as well. And I'm really excited to read your work.
Thanks, Dawn. And as I've said, I'm Kathleen McCracken. I published 8 collections of poetry, the most recent of which was a bilingual new and selected called Double Self-Portrait with Mir. For 30 years, I was a lecturer in creative writing, contemporary literature at Ulster University. Retired from there 2 years ago in order to focus on my writing. So I've been quite busy with that. I'm working on 2 new collections, one of which is a novel in verse called A Sound Gunman. And I've also become involved recently with Maca Press, so I'm a board member of that fledgling press here in Belfast. As you might tell from my accent, I'm Canadian originally, but I've lived here for quite some time. Okay, so that's us, and I'd like to go on then to talk a little bit about the background to the award. The details about the Mairtín Crawford Award are there on the Crescent Arts website, but I just thought it might be a nice way to start off to say a little bit about how this award came about. It was inaugurated in 2017 by the poet Moira Donaldson, and it's now in its 9th year. It is an award for new and emerging poets who are working towards a first full collection. And it was established by Moira, who was a good friend of Mairtín Crawford's, really as a way of honoring him. He was a writer, a poet, an arts critic, died very suddenly, unexpectedly in 2004. He was part of a poetry group that centered around Gyro's Poetry Collective. Very few of you will probably remember that, but it was a collective, an arts collective here in Belfast back in the 70s, I think, 70s, 80s time. He was also the editor of a radical poetry journal called The Big Spoon. And if you have a copy of any of those issues, they're probably worth a small fortune now. Um, he was also arts and culture editor for Fortnight magazine, a facilitator at the Crescent Arts Centre, and then became writer in residence at the Crescent Centre, and was director of Between the Lines Festival for some time. So he was very active, and he was very interested in ensuring the representation of diverse and marginalized voices within the community. Spent a lot of time promoting access to poetry through creative writing workshops. So I think, he really did deserve honoring in the way that this award does. About his publications, I mean, there was a selected poems published in 2005, and an updated version of that is due to be published hopefully this year. It was to be last year, the 20th anniversary of his death, but we're still looking forward to that. It should be on the shelves very soon. So that's a potted brief history of the award. So as we get down into the nitty-gritty, then Dawn, I'll pass back to you to talk a bit about the practicalities of submitting to the Mairtín Crawford Award.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kathleen. Yeah, I'll just talk for a wee minute about some of those practicalities and a bit about our job as judges as well. It's our second year as judges for the award. This year will be a little bit different in that poet Melina Williamson, she'll compile a long list of poets from the entries received and anonymously then Kathleen and myself will whittle this down to a short list from which we'll choose a winner. Last year we sat in Kathleen's house and had lunch and talked through the shortlist and arrived at our winner and runners up. So it's something we do take a long time over. The closing date is 12 p.m. Noon on Wednesday, the 9th of April, 2025. So there's still quite a bit of time to prepare your entry. You can submit between 3 and 5 poems, with the stipulations being that it's £10 per entry. So you can for every 3 to 5 poems you submit is £10. You can enter as many times as you want. There's sort of more details on how to do this exactly on the website. But it's more or less that you, as far as I'm aware, that you pay your entry fee online and you get an order number which goes into your email. Yeah, then you can sort of put your name and whatnot in the cover letter. So the poems that we are given are anonymous ultimately, so we don't ever know who has written them. The poetry entries that you can submit, they can be previously published in print or online, or they could have been broadcast or won a prize. The one condition is that the poet has not had a full collection of poems published. And the other stipulation is that at least one poem that you submit is unpublished work. So the other ones can be published, but as long as one of them isn't. So the entrant must not, yeah, have had a full collection of poems. Yeah, each poem must be no longer than 60 lines. Um, is another sort of common rule. If you have more detailed questions and the terms and conditions as well, they're all on the festival website, bookfestival.com/Mairtín Crawford Award. Or you can also email the team at the BBF submissions at crescentarts.org. But those details again are on the website. The other sort of practical advice is just how you format your poems. If you're not sort of maybe this is your first time submitting to an award, you would put a different poem on a different page. You would format it all quite simply. So you're not sort of trying to impress with your use of font or font size, or anything sort of singing or dancing. Typically, we would ask for Times New Roman font, not because we particularly like it, but just because it's an industry standard font and it's sort of invisible for that reason. So when we get the poems, what we're really looking at are the words on the page rather than how they're styled in that sense. You would also put your poems into single line spacing. Um, and then I mean, checking your spelling, obviously. I mean, seems like an obvious thing, but it's something I still have to remind myself occasionally to do. You wouldn't really adorn it with any pictures or anything like that. You know, if you've written a poem based on a painting or a picture, there's no need to attach the picture as well. It should really just look how the page of a poetry book looks. The visual impact is important in that sense. But having said that, it is still okay for you as a poet to intentionally experiment and disrupt the line or do something different with your layout if that's relevant to your poem, but only if it is relevant to your poem. I think that's about it as an overview. If there's more questions that come up, practically or otherwise, esoteric questions about the day-to-day life, nature of existence, just put them in the chat. I'm going to bring it up now so we can see all your questions if you type them in. And I think, Kathleen, we're just going to talk through maybe some of the more common questions. And if there's anything that comes up, just pop them in there and please do.
Yeah, I thought we might start off, Dawn, talking about the importance of this award to a poet's career,
Mhm.
particularly a new or emerging poet's career. Not maybe just start by making one point and then you can come back in on it. But I think it's maybe not about thinking about this as a competition, but as an opportunity. And whether you win or place or show or don't show or win or place at all, um, doing the submission, I think, gives you an impetus to write. It gives you a focus, a way of getting into that experience of preparing a submission.
Mhm.
Time that you spend working closely with your poems, editing, revising, selecting, meeting the deadline, that involves you in process. And to me, that's just as important as winning any award, because if you're going to have a vocation as a writer, cultivate a vocation as a writer, that's what you want to be doing, is involving yourself day to day with that work of writing, editing, meeting deadlines, etc. So for me, that's one of the most important reasons for entering a competition like this.
Mhm. Yeah, it is. No, that's absolutely right. I mean, I think all the poets that do approach the Mairtín Crawford Awards are of different experience levels. I remember I entered poems into it before I had a pamphlet of poems published, and it did feel really, really important to do. I think in those early days, it's about sort of setting yourself up a little bit with a writer's CV, nearly just like here's, and you submit something and you were to get longlisted or you were to get shortlisted. It's just always something that you can write down and sort of have a record of. Um, which is great because having a CV as a writer is kind of weird. It's a weird one, and you can have a CV when you're employed or have a job, but as a writer, it's more difficult. So these kind of things always I think are good to do. But I think in terms of just on a personal level, I think just sort of taking yourself seriously as a writer. There's something in the act of that, of sitting down and putting your best poems into a file and sending them off and clicking that button. That can just feel important, I think, psychologically to ourselves as a writer too, and just to know that your work is being received and read with care by us. And yeah, it is very important. Yeah, it's one of those early steps in your career for sure.
I think this particular award too is unique in that we're looking for 3 to 5 poems. Very often, you're paying per individual poem to submit to a competition, or you're only asked to submit one. We're here with the 3 to 5. You're creating a kind of, or curating a mini collection. So
Mhm.
sometimes people ask about, wow, what should I put in? Should they all be the same kind of poem? Should they all be different? And that's really up to you as the writer. But it gives you an opportunity, I think, to think about not just one poem, but a group of poems. And eventually, if you carry on with your writing, that becomes a collection of poems. So it's a first step in curating a collection. And we'll talk a little bit later maybe about what goes into that or how you shape that. But just that
Mhm.
idea that it's an important award in that sense, a worthwhile award to try for, in that sense that it gives you that opportunity as well
Yeah.
to curate and really think about your work in terms of a sequence or a group of poems, the beginning, a middle, and end.
Yeah. It is important, and I think linked to that, I noticed that Ruth there in the chats just asked, does it matter if the submitted 3 to 5 poems are on a similar theme, or should they display a width of style or inspiration? Yeah, there's no need for them to have the same theme. You don't have to have them all pointing in the same direction by any means. You might find that they do, just in that they're sort of written in a sort of similar time space. But if they're completely different, that's fine as well. But it also the other side of that is it's not necessary for them to display a width of style and inspiration either. These poems can be about anything. But as Kathleen says, sometimes it is a nice opportunity to think of them as a collection, as a miniature collection. What's your first poem and what's the last poem? But yes, they can be on anything.
Yeah,
Um,
we've had both varieties, haven't we, over,
yeah, we have. We have.
and we're some are very different.
There's a
Somebody
lot of a lot of starlings in last year's poems. Was a big theme that came up for some reason. Everyone was writing about the murmuration. I think of the lagan was really in people's minds, in a funny way.
But I think we welcome, a collection of 5 they're all very diverse, and we also welcome a collection that is, connected. The poems are interconnected, or
Yeah.
they're exploring a particular style. Just what you feel is your strongest work, I think, is really the bottom line in terms of what you put forward.
And then there's obviously that the monetary reward. You might actually sort of win that, and also the idea of winning dedicated writing time as well, and how beneficial that can be for a poet's career. I think that's one of the hardest things is getting the time to do this when you're a mom or you're busy and you're working and or you have three cats like I do and trying to find a minute is hard. So yeah, it's worthwhile. It's really worthwhile in that respect.
Did we mention, or did you mention there in the practicalities, Dawn, about what the award consists of for
Yeah,
whoever?
no, I don't think it did. Actually, that would have been a good thing to let me just bring that up and I'll come back to that even.
Well, I think
But it
off
is
the
on
top
the
of my head,
website as well.
you double check me, but I think off the top of my head, the winner receives £500 and it's three
That's
or
right.
4 days of dedicated writing time in a special, very nice room in the Crescent Arts
That
Centre, as well as time in a hotel.
That's right. It's the winner for each award receives a £500 cash prize. And in addition, each winner can take up a time to write package, which includes a 3-night stay at a hotel in Belfast and 4 days dedicated writing space in the Crescent. And then the two runners up each, they get a cash prize of £250 as well. So yeah, that's great.
Yeah, so that kind of it encourages you towards, perhaps attaining that dedicated writing time through the
Yeah.
award, um, as well as the monetary award, which is great. But again, I guess I would just say again, it's not so much about competition as self-validation in that involving yourself with submitting, editing, going to the workshops, in a way, becoming part of a writing community or a poetry community by engaging with this award because you're here to workshop today. There's a live workshop that Dawn's taking 8th of March, I think it is,
I think
in
that's right.
the Arts. You'll probably want to go to the presentation of the awards. You're engaged with Mairtín Crawford's legacy. So there, you're putting yourself out there, so to speak, in terms of becoming part of a poetry community by entering into this award. And not all awards offer that. I mean, sometimes just you submit online, you never hear anything. Whereas
Yeah.
with this, there is, I think the organizers at the Crescent have made a real effort to create something around the award that's involving of those that submit. And to me, that's really valuable.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Okay, well, we'll keep an eye on the chat there. Something else we thought we could talk about was the question of what we're looking for. You're probably all wondering, what do these judges have in mind? What exactly do they want? What makes a good poem? And Dawn, do you want to say for what for you makes a good poem?
Yeah, I mean it's a it's hard in a way to sort of say what there's nothing that I'm sitting here with a concept in my mind of what I'd like to see. It's one of those things that in a sense that when you see it, you just kind of know. There's practical things you could speak about, the sort of the attention to craft and form, how this person who has submitted this poem have really thought about maybe the line, the sense of the poetic line where they break the poem. And I guess, how the poem arrives at a sort of at a sense of a lightning strike, some sense of a kind of uplift or a feeling of emotion, sort of where the poem arrives at the end. I think one of the, I'll maybe talk about this more later about things that can go wrong in writing poems, but one of the hardest things is keeping your mind together to kind of make the poem work. What was the point of this? What was I trying to write? Because we can start off with so many different images and feelings. And somebody who sort of manages to do that is kind of a magician, whenever you manage to bring together images and feelings in something that ultimately kind of makes you feel something at the end of it in a way that makes you feel like you've seen it for the first time even. Um, and I think like so many of the poets last year did that so well. There was just this feeling of like I was, you know, a giraffe, a swimming pool, somebody's everyday life. The poems don't have to be about something anything other than your life, than the day to day, the detritus of living in Belfast or Northern Ireland or wherever you do live. And so yeah, I guess that's it. I suppose being moved, a sense of this person's paid attention to something that's happening and is conveying it to you in a way that feels authentic. Yeah, I would say that that's probably the main thing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know what I can add to that because that's pretty much what I'm looking for as well. But I think, this idea of being surprised, of being wakened up, um, not to necessarily some new subject, but just to seeing, as you say, the ordinary in a new way. That is always really exciting to me. I guess for me, what I'm looking for is a balance of the word music with the close observation. And together, if those two things are working well together, I'm moved emotionally. I mean, from a poet's point of view, if you're reading or if you're sharing a poem with somebody and there's that sort of expression of surprise, oh, or I've
Yeah.
had people, say, oh, I'm moved to tears. You've done something right. I think if you get that kind of emotional reaction to what you've written, but that, like Don says, that requires a kind of magic act in getting the fresh use of language, the innovative approach to form, in line with an idea or an emotion being expressed succinctly, all the technical imbalance with the ideational. It's not easy to do, but I think that's what we're looking for is that unique, exciting perspective and also an individual voice, that idea that here's someone speaking or writing in a way that I haven't heard before, but that seems inimical to them. That's a fresh voice. And then that comes from, Seamus Heaney's talked about this, where's a voice coming from? How do you create a voice? But it's through influences as
Mhm.
much as your own developing sensibility. But that I think we're looking for that too, kind of voice that's unique and sustained across those poems. We might see it emerging in different ways in the five different poems, but there's something that unifies them, and we
Yeah.
might call that voice.
That's it. I think voice is so important. It's that idea of being poets of the ordinary in some way, of the words that you use in your day-to-day life and the words that you hear around you and the things you see in life. And in some way balancing that, the ordinary with the strange, maybe, as maybe some way to put it, in the sense of our lived experience. Poets tend to be certain types of people, I find, that maybe have their little antennas up all the time and there is a feeling of strangeness to the lived experience, and somehow the best poems seem to combine an awareness of that through maybe their image or their word choices, with a real sense of the ordinary, the kind of the true feeling of something. Yeah, I guess that's the trick we're all trying to do, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess also just, I think you've mentioned this already, but editorial accuracy, you
Mm.
know,
Yeah.
this wonderful sort of high wire act of combining the ordinary and the extraordinary. But then when it comes right down to final moments, you want to double check that you've got that you've paid attention to the lineation, as Don says, to the punctuation, to how the text and the page relate to each other. So there's a lot, to be considered when you're presenting the poem. Make sure you've
Mhm.
got these things right and that they're working in tandem. Yeah. So
Yeah.
we're looking for all of that. It's in tall order, isn't it?
I know, no, no big deal. Yeah. But I mean, like I think it's one of those things that to describe it makes it sound almost harder than I think the reality is you kind of see a thing and you know it and you feel it. And quite often poems can be written in 5 minutes, they just come out like that. And sometimes they don't, sometimes they take a long time. But
Yeah, those are the gifts, the 5-minute ones.
aren't they?
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
Most of the time we have to work a lot after
Yeah.
that to
Yeah.
build
That's
up
it.
time. Yeah. Okay, common errors. We thought we could talk a little bit about what some of the foibles are, things that people tend to get wrong when they're submitting it that then can may disqualify them from getting to a long list. So, and that's as important as talking about, the achievements and things to aim for.
Mhm.
So, um, for me, I guess it's really that a poem isn't presented properly, that it isn't formatted correctly. And again, it's this point I've just made that before you submit, you really need to pay attention to detail, to the typos, the spelling errors, the poor line breaks. Because when we're going through reading and we're trying to narrow down to a long list and then a short list, if you're weighing up two submissions and one has more or less perfect presentation, one has a few flaws in presentation, you're going to take the one that's perfect in presentation, even though they might be equally strong in terms of ideas or music or whatever it is that kind of has got it as far as it's got in making our lists. So it really does pay, I think, to spend a good deal of time looking at formatting and presentation. Um, Put the poem away, put the poems away for a while, come back to them, look at them more objectively in a day or two after you think you've got to the final version. Um, Something I used to always tell students to do is to read backwards. So you're looking at the poem from the very last line up to the first, because then you're not reading for sense. You're reading for punctuation and typos, just the very basic mechanics of it. And
Mhm.
that often catches things that you didn't, the eye has been deceived because it knows the poem so well. So if you do that kind of exercise, leave it away for a while, come back to it, look at it from the bottom up, that can be really helpful in terms of catching those sort of things. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. And I think that's those definitely in terms of those sort of formal choices. I think other mistakes maybe people make is just in assuming that there needs to be some kind of a poetry voice, that you need to sound a certain way or like an authority, if you know what I mean. I think some people try to sound like Louis MacNeice or something, or they try to voice their poems in an era that they're not from, which is kind of a when in fact you can really honestly just write in your own voice. And I would really encourage people to do that, to sound like yourself. And so while you're sort of, it's good and useful to model your poems sometimes on poems that exist by published writers, um, and sort of look at what they're doing and what are the logics of their poem? How do these poems even work? But the important thing is that you're doing something that's in your voice and that only you could have written it. The other thing would maybe just be cliche, is something. The thing about a poem is because they're so compressed and they're so pared down, anything that kind of comes out as cliche kind of can stick out as a sore thumb and can make you feel strangely like it gives you the impression that what you're reading isn't honest or authentic. It's a strange sort of it's a strange thing to try to explain. If you kind of read the phrase, time heals all wounds, or um, thinking outside the line, or every cloud has a silver lining, or something like that. It's okay to put those things in an early draft, but make sure when you go back that you're going to find a different way to say that in a way that feels, like you're saying it for the first time. I think that's what keeps me in a poem when I read something and I have a feeling like I'm this poet's seeing the world slightly differently, So I think I would say, yeah, just watch out for cliches and watch out for your voice, I think that you're writing in.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's just sort of laziness, of course, about cliches. It's, oh, I've heard that, that'll work there.
I
I won't take the time to think about that in a different way,
yeah.
And same for abstractions, where people, you're always better, I think, to go with the concrete image than you
Hmm.
are with the abstraction. Like, don't tell me you feel desire, show me the desire you feel, through a
Yeah.
strong image or an action. That makes your poem so much more alive. Um,
Mm.
so yeah, it's good advice to avoid the cliches, the predictable. I don't know who it was. Many people have said about killing your darlings, killing off your darlings. Sometimes the thing that you think is just the right phrase or just the right word is actually not. It's a cliche or it's just not that fresh. So they're the hardest thing to get rid of are those darlings. So again, showing your work to somebody before you submit it, they may say, "Oh well, I've heard that before. That's a bit tedious," and that can be really helpful as well before
Yeah,
you.
you can have a word that you're just dying to use, can't you? I remember being at school years ago and was dying to use the word imperative. I couldn't wait to use it, and I think I used it in every essay, and until my teacher was crossing it out and was like, "Never use never use this word." Honestly, yeah, just words that tend to be more than a few syllables. So there's always a simpler way to say it, and it's okay to just say things simply. Like somebody just looked at the moon or their face was sad or in a sense, but it's but balancing that with, yeah, not kind of veering into abstraction where you're describing a feeling rather than showing a feeling. And yeah.
The old show don't tell, isn't it?
Yeah, so many prose rules and truisms apply to poetry in the same way. Even in the sense of a prose story you associate with the idea of narrative, that it follows a sort of a, like you said, Kathleen, a beginning, a middle, and an end. Poems also follow that too. There's a sense of almost a miniature moment unfolding. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
they
however strangely.
tend to do it differently. They do it maybe through juxtaposition and
Yeah,
association rather than filling in all the details in the way a short story or novel might. But there
yeah,
is usually, at least as a reader, I know I look for a narrative. However, um, what's the right word, fragmented or abstract in a way a poem might be. I'm still looking for the narrative there.
yeah.
So we need to be aware of that. And again, it's a fine line, isn't it, between being oblique and
Mm,
suggestive and associative, associational, and spoiling the poem by making it too obscure. Yeah. So I
precisely.
guess, yeah, that is a good idea to always think about what is the narrative and can a reader find that, even though you may be doing it in quite unusual ways,
Mhm.
challenging ways.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Just one other sort of technical thing about a common error. I mean, it does say on the submission guidelines that you can submit your document as a Word or a PDF format. Um, Most of you will know what a Word document is, and that's fine. You can submit it that way, but just to, if you can translate it into a PDF document, that will lock your poem in place. In other words, the words won't shift around or the lineation won't change when you submit it or put it, from your desktop computer into the banks of the Crescent Arts Center. Sometimes in that transmission, things will slip about. So I didn't used to do this, but I now do send almost everything as a PDF for that very reason. Because especially with poetry, if you have a word that you want isolated by itself, one line over to the right or something, it'll stay that way with the PDF. So that seems really technical, I know, but it's worth knowing about. And if that seems like gobbledygook language, just ignore it. You submit it as a Word document. But for those of you that can, I think it's good advice to put it into a PDF document.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. What else here? Are there specific themes? Should the submissions all be the same theme? What range of material should be in the submission? One of you's asked about that already in the chat, and we may have answered that to some degree. But I think, it's important to say that as judges, we're really open to reading everything. We're not looking for a particular topic or arrangement, a relationship between the poems. But if you want that to be there, that's absolutely fine. If there is a theme across the poems, if there's a subject that you want to show us how you've been tracing that through a sequence of poems, that's fine. But if you've been experimenting with a number of forms, you've got a sonnet, you've got a villanelle, you've got, a two-line poem, that's also interesting because it shows us the range of formal and technical ability that you have and the range of interest that you have. So
Mm.
that's what I would say about that. If you're working on a group, then do submit the ones that sit well together. You might have 20 poems that you're choosing from, but try to pick the ones that you think are in some ways talking to one another or are harmoniously arranged. In relation to one another, if that makes sense. Yeah. Dawn, do you want to add anything
Yeah.
to
No,
that?
I don't think I have anything maybe to add that I haven't already sort of mentioned with regards to that. I think that's maybe it. I mean, it can be nice to just sort of visually um submit different sorts of poems, like a short one and a longer one, and sometimes that kind of visual interest can be a good thing as well. But yeah, nothing really to add to that other than anything really goes. Yeah.
Yeah, it can be quite. I remember one time myself entering, I don't know, three or four poems to a competition, and afterwards the person that judged it said, I didn't realize that these were by the same person
Oh.
because they seemed so different. And that was really surprising to me. But
Mhm.
I think what she was saying to me, well, that was interesting to me to know that you could do these different things with your form and your voice. So There's
Yeah.
virtues in having relationships between them and also virtues in not having relationships between the poems you submit.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It's just a chance to try that, isn't it? Maybe a prose poem, versus a margin poem versus
Mhm.
yeah, different sorts of styles. It's good. Yeah, it's a good chance to just do that and show your range if you want to. But yeah, it's not as if marks are allocated though for a range of forms. It's just if you want to do that, maybe you can. Yeah.
I think too, if you're looking at contemporary poetry publications, you'll be realizing that poets are playing with presentation on the page and the form that they're using much more frequently than
Mm.
they used to. Not all poems all start, or not all lines of every poem start at the left-hand margin anymore. Many start at the right-hand margin. Sometimes they're short prose poems. In fact, last year we had a number of what we might call prose poems, didn't we, Don?
Yeah, there really were. There really were. I think there's a kind of an influence as well that comes in from maybe the type of poems that are published in maybe the New York Times, and there's a sort of more of an American poetry trend. I wouldn't say trend, it's something that's been around for a long time, but it's something that I feel like I'm seeing a lot, which is that the title of the poem is the first line of the poem, and then continuing into the poem. And I'm seeing that a lot. I think I started to do it myself recently. Yeah, so there's this kind of as well, but it's yeah, I can't remember what my point was there, but other than just
The variety
yeah,
of
the variety, isn't that it? Yeah.
that people are combining, in one collection,
Yeah.
varieties of forms now. And you used to pick a poetry book up and every poem looked the same, where it doesn't anymore. And as a reader, again, I think we find that very interesting and
Hmm.
inspiring and liberating in some ways that, okay, now I have license to try something new on the
Yeah.
page. So I guess that's kind of an argument for submitting 3 to 5 poems, which are differently shaped on the page,
Hmm.
as well as having different subjects. Yeah.
It really can just free you up to say something a bit differently. I mean, you can get into a habit, I think, with poems where you're almost just everything has, for some arbitrary reason, 3 or 4 lines in a stanza, and then you just break it, and that's kind of, and I find sometimes thinking about form or trying something a little bit different can help you with maybe the point of the poem or what you're trying to achieve with the poem. Maybe if you're trying something that feels like you're writing about anxiety, for example, and almost like trying it out differently than how you've originally drafted it. Maybe try it again with shorter lines or shorter stanzas. Like does it seem to move quicker or does it seem to achieve formally, what it is you're trying to achieve emotionally? Can be helpful as well. Mm.
Yeah, for sure. Like the form does have to link to the content in some way, I think. And
Yeah.
again, just to use an example of my own work, I had a poem which was about a road trip, a road journey, and my father driving a car, and it's one long line, really, but I kept it, all in one stanza for that reason, because I wanted it to flow along, from beginning to end without a stop. And that form worked for that because it was very congested and sort of
Yeah.
tight, in the way that the drive was. Whereas other poems, I've done some recently, which are two-liners, a bunch of two-liners, because you wanted that sort of flash moment. You want almost like a photograph to happen, and then
Yeah.
here's another photograph, and here's another photograph. So it really, in a way, you let the poem tell you what form it needs to take, I think. But that
Yeah.
can come either immediately or through reflection
Hmm.
later on, as you say, discovering a different form when you come back to it that might be more appropriate than the initial form you'd had in mind.
I think so. And also crosses my mind, a sonnet as well. Sometimes if I were to suddenly make a poem into a sonnet, how does that change almost the goal of the poem? If there's suddenly thinking about this within a framework of love, in whatever way you want to interpret that, um, can almost sort of change how the poem, yeah, where it ends up. Um,
Or
yeah.
doing kind of things with that form. I'm thinking of Terence Hayes' book recently.
Yeah.
Is it Sonnets for My Future Assassin? Something like that.
Yes.
You have to Google it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
he's taken the sonnet, this African American writer, who's taken the sonnet form, which we do kind of conventionally expect to be about love, and made highly politicized poems out of using that form. So that's interesting, to see what you do with the traditional preconceptions about what a form's going to give you, and then
Hmm.
fill it up with something
Yeah,
challenging and new and different. So
exactly. And just those kind of those kind of rules that exist within a sonnet, that at some point in a sonnet, you're going to have this moment where it turns, there's a certain tone, and then suddenly we have a moment where we turn into something else, and the poem seems to point towards something else, maybe. And th those little kind of way markers can really change how a poem unfolds as well, So yeah.
that's a ways from talking about what was it specifically.
Oh my word, yeah.
That's all right.
Yeah, that's
Um, the question of how you get started writing a poem. I mean, before most of you here today probably already have some poems in mind that you're going to be submitting for this award, be submitting elsewhere. But to go, sort of back to square one, how do we get started writing a poem? It's probably the most difficult part of composition. Where does the inspiration come from? And I suppose if we were open to all talking, you'd each have a different answer to that. Um, but what do you think about that, Don? How do you get started writing a poem? Is there a formula or
um
do we wait for
it's
that
like I've
lightning
never
bolt?
written a poem. Suddenly I'm like, oh my God, how do you write a poem?
Yes.
I think it's part of that kind of idea. I think there's another question that we were thinking about, which was how do you maybe what's your process? Maybe that sort of comes in a similar sort of way. Um where, I think I have a tendency to have things that kind of haunt me, like certain images or certain little sort of certain moments of the day, certain images. Um, I think I was saying before about I was like standing in a queue in a deli one day, and I think I was quite stressed and I was a bit sort of absent-minded, and I think I'd pressed my finger with my thumb and created a little sort of like my vein. I created a little bleed under the skin just by pressing my knuckle really hard, and I was like, there was something about the image of that um seemed to speak to something bigger, but I didn't really know how to write about it, and sometimes I just make a note of that that happened, and I find that whatever is happening in your weird poet brain that we seem to have is that when you're walking around, then I kind of I'm collecting maybe certain lines or images or words even, and then I think for me, then when I do sit at some point to write, it can feel difficult to do. I think I can sometimes just not enjoy the feeling of having to write a poem, to be honest. When I sit down and I have to start writing, it can feel kind of I can resist it because of the sort of I can find myself resisting it because of the emotion or the intensity of it and this kind of thing. But so often for me it's about finding a way through that. Um, which can what I found helpful recently, is I've sort of been trying a different form, a different way. I've been picking a particular form and trying to write in that, and something that allows me to bring out a certain narrative while also having an attention to the line. So often I think how we start writing poems can be so different. You can have those poems that just kind of pour out of you, you don't think about, or there can be just when you sit down and you have to intentionally start. Um, I think I'll quite often start with an image or something that's in my own voice, or as if I'm talking to someone. And maybe I'll come and take that out later. But allowing yourself an access point is often, to me, I think some of my best work are text messages to my friends where I'm making fun of them or slagging them or something, and like they're some of my best writing. And so sometimes it's trying to like replicate that non-self-conscious mind. I don't think that's helpful at all. Reflecting on it. How do you start your poems, Kathleen?
And a variety of ways. I mean, I think I've been asked that question, I don't know how many times, but often for me, it starts with a phrase or a sound, like a musical sort of phrase. And
Hmm.
then I'll build on that and it kind of unwinds from that. For me to sit and stare at a blank screen is anathema. I mean, I can't
Yeah.
do that. Um, I used to do that when I was, a teenager. I think, right, 8 o'clock tonight till 9 o'clock, I sit here and I write something. I didn't have a screen back then. I'm old enough to have been of the pencil and paper generation. But, it was that idea that you had to sit and come up with something in a certain space of time. And I used to be able to do that. I think that was more like exercises. And maybe when you're starting as a poet, as a writer of any sort, that is a good thing to do because it
Mhm.
forces you to confront that blank page and just think about even getting a few words down.
Yeah.
As time's gone on and one gets busier, there are more demands. You maybe don't have that luxury of
Mm.
even an hour every day. So it tends to come through a bit like I always think of it as tuning a radio, and I
Yeah.
hear this or that coming through, and I get that phrase or line, I'll write that down. It might sit there for a week before I get back to it. Or, in fact, that poem I mentioned just a few minutes ago about my father driving the car, I was in the bath, and you're just relaxing in the bath, that whole thing. And I was yelling at my daughter, get me a piece of paper, and sat on the floor in the bathroom and wrote the thing in one go. That
Yeah.
that's wonderful when that happens, but it can be at those inopportune moments when you don't have a pen and paper to hand. Guess now we have the phone with the can take a note. But yeah, that's sort of how it starts for me is that
Mm.
phrase or word. Um, the other thing I would say about that is that if I do have a general idea of what I want to be writing about, sometimes doing research is the way. It almost sounds like maybe a prose writer, fiction writer, but I would need to do a lot of research and get myself into the world that I'm wanting to write about, and then it
Mhm.
stays with me. I'm living it. I'm saying this because at the moment I'm writing a long piece about somebody during World War II, conjuring that voice and myself in dialogue with this person. But in order to do that, I have to know a lot about that person's life and about the milieu and the time period. It becomes almost scholarly. But um, living in that world, I think, gives you a kind of sense of what to say, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, say you were wanting to write, I don't know, about something that's happened here historically, a news story of the moment what you can choose a subject like that, and if you're passionate about it, that will so fill your mind and your
Yeah.
life that you're just going to write because you're compelled to, because the information is there, you're bubbling with it, and that can be quite useful, I think, even if
Mhm.
it's very limited, newspaper story, flash in the pan, but it's triggered your imagination and do
Well,
that research work. Sorry, go on.
no, that's really, I think that is really good. That the point about the newspaper and I mean, I heard a story on the news a couple of weeks ago that turned into a poem for me, and I heard about this a mother, a killer whale who was found swimming 10 miles off the coast of Canada, and she had given birth, but the young orca hadn't survived, and she was just nosing it ahead of her, in the water, and she was kind of found, and she'd been doing that for days. And there was something about this image that just really stayed with me, and found myself thinking about it. I spent some time in Texas a few weeks ago, um, but I couldn't really think of a way to present to bring that into a poem. And so I find that quite often what we're trying to do as poets is knit together images with feelings and somehow put that into words. And it can just take inspiration, whatever that is, to do that, whether that's a muse, maybe you're writing to a lover or somebody or a friend. Sometimes it's through maybe going to the Ulster Museum and sitting looking at a painting and ekphrasis, this idea of describing a painting, describe what's going on in a painting that strikes you. Um, that struck you for some reason, and you describing what you're seeing on the painting allows you to write about all of these other things somehow, and allows you to bring them together through image. Um, yeah, it's that. I think it's somehow managing to like the murmuration, bring all of these things together somehow into something that reads as cohesive.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think a lot of us I mean, we're interested in paintings as artists, as writers. We're interested in other people's writing. Of course, we're all readers, but to go to paintings, to go to films, to go to music, if you're if you're sort of stuck, and that leads into maybe the next question we were going to talk about, but if you're stuck on a poem, or on writing a poem, you kind of don't know how to get going. I
Mm.
think just giving yourself time to immerse in other art forms, as much as going for a walk with the dog, might
Yeah,
be might give you something. This word inspiration is a fraught one, but I think there's a truth in that the breath, the the aspiration, the inspiration has to come into you through a kind of living
Yeah.
energy. And you can get that from being out in the world, observing people, listening to people. But you can also get it from other forms of art. And there's a rich back catalogue of poetry that has engaged with the other arts. And, I find that really, really
Hmm.
stimulating myself. I listen to, well, I suppose Dylan is the example of the moment, but he's kind of been there all my life. But to go back and listen to somebody like that, even if it's just one word you pick up and then suddenly you're writing out of that, it becomes your own thing.
Yeah.
So other arts, everyday life, and there's a Canadian writer, Timothy Findlay. One of the refrains in his novel, The Wars, is pay attention, pay attention. And I've always kind of remembered that as a mantra because if you go through life paying attention, you're much more likely to find that moment
Yeah.
that leads to the poem, I think. So yeah, there's all, but we all do it differently. How we get started. Sometimes brainstorming, workshops. They'll often say just sit down and put anything down that comes to you on the page, and that can work too. Because out of
Yeah.
that, you maybe get a word or phrase that kickstarts, um, a whole poem or sequence or ultimately book even for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
It is, isn't it? It is that kickstart, that idea of something that grabs you. You're like, that was the thing that was missing. That was my imperative that I needed. I needed to hear that word and use that word. And that can happen in so many ways. Yeah, I do. I mean, I think just through reading poetry and seeing how other people are doing something and thinking about, yeah, their logics. But yeah, I do think that is it. I think I experienced that after I wrote We Play here, because I'd written it in a very particular kind of a form. There was written the lyric poem sequences, but it was something that was very particular to that book, and it was something that I didn't necessarily feel like I want to suddenly write like that going forward. And so for me, I kind of struggled a little bit, and I was like, "Am I ever going to write again? I don't know if I will. Maybe I won't." And recent, I mean, it is relatively recently. I feel like that I've started to unlock some like a way to write again, and for me, it was finding a form. It was finding a way that allowed my brain to move through poems again. I can find sometimes sitting down to write a line margin poem, I can find it hard in some ways. I can find it almost like my brain works to compress everything. So sometimes I find that there's no air in what I'm writing. Like I'll write poems and they're too tight, there's no room for just your voice and it's almost too compressed. It's like you've over reduced the gravy and so for me, like it's finding a way to bring in that air. And for me recently it was writing across the page and sort of forgetting about the line breaks and kind of and then sort of redrafting. It can be just finding your own particular method of doing things that lets you, yeah, open up, bring your voice out onto the page. That's it, really, isn't it? What we're trying to do.
Yeah, I think so. And I think something poets are maybe more prone to being guilty of, if that's the right word, than prose writers. Is that kind of compression that you're talking about? We know what we're saying.
Yeah.
We're saying it in such a tight way, that we've left out key elements. And
Mhm.
poetry does that, it does read the wasteland. Um, there's a lot left out, and we have to fill in that narrative. But there's also something about finding, as you're saying, the air, the
Mhm.
space for your own voice within and around and behind that compression at the
Mhm.
same time as you're giving the reader enough
Yeah.
to keep them interested. And that is quite a balancing act. It's a lot of plates in the air.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
okay, maybe we'll move on. What do you do if you're stuck on a poem? I mean, we've kind of covered that in some
Mm.
way, but what advice, what strategies could we offer you for when you're stuck on a poem?
I mean, sometimes poems just don't work out, isn't it? Occasionally you'll get a poem that just sits in your folder forever and it's never quite right. And I have many of those. Um, but sometimes it is just a matter of actually trying to make yourself put it away, isn't it? Just writing it and put it away and come back to it later.
Yeah.
Or else, but you do need that space sometimes, don't you, to sort of think, does this even make sense? Am I Is it?
Yeah, to
Yeah.
step back from it, I guess, and not to
Back.
force it, to be kind of
Yeah.
at ease with the fact that you're not writing it right now.
Yeah.
Either you haven't started it at all, or it's been started, but you just can't move with it.
Hmm.
I mean, I was listening to an interview with Michael Longley just since his passing there, where he talked about being silent for 10 years. And he
Yeah.
said, I can't, you know, he'd written a couple of collections and then there was a big silence when he just wasn't writing.
Hmm.
I thought he talked beautifully about that, that I had to kind of accept the silence and
Yeah.
not get anxious about that not writing. Uh, you know, because I think we've all had periods where we just don't feel we can write, just nothing's coming through.
Yeah.
But to be comfortable with that is a strategy for what to do when you're stuck. Don't think of it as stuckness, maybe, but as a time of imbibing and fertilizing and resting in the way
Yeah.
trees rest over the winter time, you know. Um,
Yeah.
so not to force it and just let the ideas and the words come to you when they're ready to. And I know that sounds rather esoteric and all, but it does happen.
Mhm.
That for times, like you said, Don, you didn't know if you're ever going to write again, and then suddenly you find a way through it by a form, or you encounter a subject, or you hear something something gets your interest, and
It
you're on.
is. No, it is. It's the idea of wintering, isn't it? Where you're sort of allowing that to happen, whatever it is that happens in that kind of in the winter. I think I was reading something recently that said that, you think of traditionally of winter as a time of everything dying off and nothing happening, but such a lot of importance is happening under the surface, in terms of water swelling and cracking and turning into, other things, preparing things to grow again, and poetry is such, it's impossible to separate poems from who we are as people and what's going on in our lives. And sometimes you just go through periods that it's a hard time, and it can be hard to write into things when you're in the middle of them as well. So it's okay. It's perfectly okay sometimes when things aren't working out. But when it is just sometimes it is just a particular tricky poem that you get stuck on, for whatever reason. And yeah, I mean, I find the most useful thing would just be talking to other poets, talking to other people about it, in the same way that we talk about any problem. Poetry seems very psychologically linked to just how we engage with problems in general, and things in life. Getting some support, getting some feedback. Yeah.
All right, had a wee technical problem there, but it seems to be okay. You hear
Yeah.
me, Dawn?
I can hear you again.
Yeah,
Yeah.
great. Okay, good. Yeah, all right. So let's move on to our next question, shall we? That
Hmm.
distracted me from, but okay.
No,
Um,
very good.
what do we do with draft work? How do we work with older work, or how do we work with notes? That's something that is often asked, I think, in workshop settings. What do poets do with these things? Um, I think it's always productive to go back and have an attempt at an older piece of work, like a draft. Sometimes I even forget that I've got a poem, and then I'll come back to it and think, all right, actually, I can make something out of that, or it fits with
Hmm.
something I'm doing now. So point being, always keep your drafts, whether they're in a folder in your documents or physically present on the desk. I mean, I do know people who say, no, I don't keep anything, no drafts, no draft work at all. But I'm too much of a hoarder for that. And I think sometimes it can be really valuable to go back to work that you had set aside and rework it. Likewise with notebooks. I mean, you probably all keep notebooks, and just jotting things down can be really useful at some point when you go back and look over them. I mean, sometimes I go away in the summer for a couple of weeks and I take the notebooks that I've been collecting up all year, and I go back over it and realize, oh gosh, there's something I've forgotten about, but I can work on that now. So
Hmm.
that's my sort of methodology for turning back to work that I might have not necessarily discarded, but just set aside or kept as notes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's that, isn't there? That sense of a poem. A good poem is always about at least two things. It's always at the heart of a poem, there's always a tension, it's somehow finding that energy. There's always like two things going on, sort of what the poem is about. Um, and then what it's kind of really about, this sort of sense of that and that merging of that. Sometimes you don't know what a poem's about until you get to the last line and you surprise yourself, which are the best poems, I think, do. So I think often with drafts, I can end up with I had this idea that I wanted to get a tattoo recently I'll just say it, of a coyote on my arm. And I had this idea that I wanted to do that. And for some reason I kept thinking about it and wanted to write a poem about about things for some reason and why we get tattoos of certain images and why they're important to us. And I think it took me a while eventually coming back to it and realizing I was really talking about image. I was really talking about the importance of aspiring towards something. I'd had this idea of getting a tattoo also of a satellite. I never get these tattoos. I just think what would be a nice tattoo and never get it. But it was of the is it the in the movie Contact, there's those huge sort of satellite dishes in New Mexico. And then it was just this idea of, I guess, it came down to then this image of this huge satellite picking things up in space, things that have been sent out and are coming back. And there was sort of this idea of like maybe stuff that you've broadcast back in the 80s, almost to yourself, thoughts that you've had that in some ways you in the now can receive it or hear it. And it took a while to kind of even arrive at what I was trying to get at with the image of those as satellites. So sometimes it's just leaving a poem and thinking, just my teenage son says to me all the time, trust. Every time I'm like, have you done your homework? He'd be like, trust. So I think sometimes writing a draft and just trust that you will come back and you will find out what the other half of it is, because you will.
Yeah, yeah. That is it called array? Those all
The,
those issues.
is it the
Something
VLA,
array.
the very something array, the very large array? Yeah, VLA, isn't it? Something like, yeah,
I think so. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, because I have a couple of tattoos and I've written about them too, and it's almost like it's the image, isn't it? Like I haven't
Hmm.
written about my tattoo, but I've written about the images that are in the tattoo and what that sort of says about your own psychology, I guess, your own state of mind. But
Yeah,
yeah, things that are very personal like that can sometimes lead to very big ideas. You're talking about the array dish and all that that means, and just the things like you said about your pressure on your finger, things that are so tiny and so personal, but can lead to very big statements about the
yeah,
state of our world. And that's what drafts and notes can lead to, I think. And maybe it's just a passing moment where you've noted that
yeah,
image or write poem about tattoo. And then it evolves. So it's always valuable, I think, to keep hold of these things. We don't remember. We think we will, but we don't remember otherwise. Lots of people will say they keep a notebook beside the bed. I have a poet friend back home who's recorded her dreams that way for a year, and that's resulted in a collection, which they don't say they're dreams, but the key images have come out of that, and keeping that dream journal
hmm,
religiously has led to a collection of poems. So, notebooks, drafts, all reworking in a way is a challenge, and one that I think we meet gladly if we've got the elemental materials there.
yeah,
Yeah. Um, it's also too, I mean, old redrafting can lead to really significant shifts, like in tense. Maybe you've written a poem in the past tense and you would try it in future tense or present tense, and suddenly the poem has a whole new complexion through that
mhm,
draft work. Likewise, you might change the pronoun. Maybe it was written as she or he, or in the first person, you change it to second person, whatever. Shift around with that, and you can get some really interesting results. That's all redrafting,
yeah,
rewriting, reworking. Um, we've talked about changing the forms, um, and also about thinking about the visual arrangement on the page. You come back to a draft and you think, right, now if I rearrange that on the page, break it up a bit, move lines here and there, it's suddenly the poem is like getting a new suit of clothes. The presentation as well as the meaning, the cerebral impact of it
yeah,
changes significantly. So never, I guess the the bottom line is never think of a first draft as a finished thing, unless it really is one of those God-given moments when you've got it all at once, but those are rare. So
Yeah.
yeah. Anything else you'd like to add to that,
I don't
Dawn?
think so. I don't think so. I think that is it. I think that's pretty much covered it. Mm.
Uh, um, we'll do a couple more of these and then we'll
Yeah.
see if there are any questions and give you some final tips maybe. But this question of when is a poem finished often comes
Mm.
up. We're talking a lot about redrafting and always going back to things. How do you know when you actually have arrived at the completion for the moment anyways? I mean, I
Yeah.
think poets are always revising, and I've been
Mm.
writing about other poets for many years. And if they do, they do a collection, then they do a selected, then they do a collected. And if you compare those editions, you'll always find that there are changes.
Yeah.
And so even though it's in print, it's constantly evolving.
Yeah. I mean, I think I like that sort of Belfast poet Derek Mahon was absolutely crazy for that. Like, I mean, his poems have just so many different versions that they're almost like different poems.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I don't love doing that. I think I like to feel like something is written and it's done, and then sometimes getting it published can be that line that you draw under it that it found a home and it's done. Um, but how do you know when a poem is done? I mean, often I think when you read a poem out loud, and you will hear, if it's kind of running smoothly, like a kind of mechanic listening to a motor engine of a car, I think you can sort of tell if there's any hitches, if there's any like if there's too many syllables, maybe sometimes in a line. Sometimes words just don't sound right. Maybe you just need a different sounding word. Maybe you just need to go in and have a look at what sort of internal rhyme is working in this poem. Have I got words that are chiming off each other? And it can just feel
Yeah.
pleasing and it can feel done, isn't it? It's just, I mean, we're talking about intuition and maybe in feelings, but those are traditionally seen as female values, but are very, very important. I think, yeah, just sometimes you just know if you've hit it and it feels right. And that, I think what that is, yeah, comes down to sound, comes down to image.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, on to read your poem to
Mm,
yourself. And now that we have all these devices, it's easy enough to record yourself if there isn't somebody there to listen to you. It can be really instructive to listen to your poem back to yourself. So if you've got a recording device on your phone or your computer, read it, listen again, record it again, listen again, because that will point out things to you that you never see on the page, you don't hear on the page.
yeah,
Um, again, years ago, I sometimes the first time I would hear my own poem was if I did a reading publicly, and suddenly you realize, oh God, that just isn't right. I'm gonna have to fix that. But I think now we've much more opportunity to hear ourselves before we let it loose on the world. So that can often be the litmus test, really, is how does it sound? Are all the parts, as you say, running like a
hmm,
well-oiled engine? Or does something clunk? Is
yeah,
something not quite right about the
yeah,
sound of it? And also, too, you pick up certain images that just, as you're running that narrative through your visual mind, they aren't fitting right. So, yeah,
yeah.
that's a
And
good.
just paying attention to how you feel when you read it too. I think so, quite often when I'm writing poems, I think if I find the emotions there in my throat or I can feel it, if
Yeah.
it's evoking that in yourself, then you've been, I think, as authentic as you can be.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Also, I guess about the ending, I have a note here to myself about the ending being open or enticing and yet satisfying to readers. There's sometimes the idea that a poem has to tie everything up. You get to the final line, it has to bring everything together and make a statement or something. It doesn't. It's a moment in time. Again, the
Mm.
photograph analogy that it's like a snapshot in one single moment very often. So it's better maybe to leave the ending open with the reader with a question mark. It's more satisfying in a strange way than having everything tied together and sort
Yeah.
of spoon fed to the reader. the exciting poem leaves you as a reader with something to think about. So that's maybe another criteria for thinking about whether a poem's finished when it actually isn't finished, when it has an open ending like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. I think Heaney would have done that really well. He tends to finish his poems with, I feel, sounds or kind of images. I mean, I'm thinking of like Personal Helicon and his poem where he's looking down the well and really seeing himself at the bottom of the well reflected in the water, and how he sort of like compared that poem to, essentially looking back into his own childhood, and to set the darkness echoing, this kind of idea of almost ending on a something that's repeating throughout hourly, spatially, and you're kind of left with this idea of an echo or the image of an echo, the visual image of a sound, it's kind of strange. But yeah, yeah, that kind of idea of like where you're leaving something in the mind of the reader and imagistically, for sure, without feeling the need to tie it all up in a bow. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, that can be,
Or a poem that sends you back to the beginning. I love a poem
yeah,
that will make me go immediately back to the beginning and want to read it again.
yes,
Not because I didn't get it, because I did get it, because I want to experience it again. It works that well.
yeah,
So
that's it.
that's the kind of feeling you can evoke in your reader. I think it probably is finished.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's it. And you can't know at the outset of a poem how it is going to end. So sometimes when you get to the end, yeah, you just want to read it again for that feeling. Yeah, that's a really good point. Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Other questions had to do with, what our practice looks like. I mean, we've sort of talked about that a little bit, Dawn, a practice, what it looks like,
Yeah.
what sort of things help us as poets. Do
Hmm.
you want to put anything into that?
I mean, a friend of mine who's a poet, I mean, she gets up every day at 5 in the morning. It's just and writes for, a couple of hours and this kind of thing, and every single day, and I don't do that. I don't think I would be able to function if I got up that early. But I think, yeah, for me, I think, yeah, probably already talked a bit about it, which is just that collection, paying attention, being bothered to whether it's take your phone out and make a note in notes of something that you've noticed. All of these things, keeping track of them because there's something always going on within us, I feel like in some way. And then just using all of that in a poem and almost not holding back, not saving it and thinking I'll save that for the future. It's just actually just sort of greedily using every image, every sound, everything you've noticed in everything. Just use it, use it, use it, and there'll be more, and trusting that there'll be more. Because there always is. Um,
Yeah.
and I think that, yeah, I think just also like in other ways, I mean, my process can also just come from I really enjoy reading poems that move me, and thinking about how they've done that. Like how is this magic trick? Trying to figure it out, like it was cups in a ball, like how have they done this? What movements has this poem taken? Um, and thinking just even trying to do that yourself in a poem, about something completely different. Yeah, those can just be interesting exercises. And sometimes just writing things down, like writing, like I say, like ekphrasis is something that I've come to more recently. It's not something I ever really used to do, but I think going and looking at paintings and even just a little exercise, write 7 sentences that come into your mind about anything, and then maybe choose one of them as the first line of your poem, and just see where it takes you. But giving yourself permission to have fun and to play, is, yeah, it can be hard to do. You can take yourself very seriously, I think, sometimes.
Yeah. For me, the practice, day-to-day practice, I mean, it depends. If I'm working on a particular poem or series of poems, I'd be writing, I become obsessive almost. I mean, it can't get me to do anything else. But then when I'm not doing that, there'd be long stretches where I am just thinking or note taking or reading, reflecting.
Mhm.
Listen to the radio,
Yeah.
watching documentary, all those research type things I've mentioned already. So it varies, it fluctuates between intensive periods of writing, particularly if one has a commission or a deadline. There's nothing like that to make you, and you have a deadline now if you're going to be submitting to this award, to this competition. But yeah, I don't think poetry is like prose and that you can't, although you're saying your friend Don who does do that, the 2 hours a day, and maybe that 2 hours involves editing and various administrative
Yeah.
things around poetry as well, doing correspondence even. But poetry, in terms of the writing of it, for me, anyways, it isn't like prose. You read Haruki Murakami on what do we talk about when we talk about running, which is a meditation on writing, really. And
Mhm.
he says, you sit for 4 hours religiously every day. And I think you can do that if you're writing a novel much more easily than if you're writing poetry, because it's that sustained form that requires a lot of detail and description. Whereas poetry is, in that sort of cliched way, much more inspired. It comes in rushes. So it's harder to talk about it as a sustained practice like that.
Mhm.
On the other hand, you are always practicing by paying attention again to come back to that point. Um, you'll all know the poet Paul Muldoon, and I've been in his company a few times, and you watch him, and he's always watching. He's so alert to everything. What's going on out there? What's happening out that window? What's that person wearing? And I think that's the duty of the poet, is just to be constantly, in a way, practicing observation.
Mhm.
What you make of it is something else, but um, I think for me that's really what the practice consists of, and then reading and listening to other poets, just keeping the antennae up again on what's going on out there. Because if you want to publish today, you need to be aware of the milieu in which you are going to be immersed, and what you're taking part in. Like Don said earlier, you don't want to be writing poems that sound and look like they were written in the 19th or the 18th century. Not that there's anything wrong, there's wonderful poems from those eras, but they're unlikely to get published today because publishers are looking for contemporary strategies, contemporary voices and perceptions. So I think it is important to be aware of what's being published, who's on the scene, so to speak, all of that. And that too can in turn stimulate what you're doing with your practice. Um, Sharing your work with and getting feedback with trusted writer friends. And like I've said repeatedly, just being passionate about your subject. I think that informs my practice more than anything. If I'm excited about what I'm trying to write, um, I'll do it, But if I don't get myself engaged with that topic or that emotion, whatever it is it's feeling, it won't happen. So. Yeah, I realize we're getting towards the end of our 90 minutes now. We can give you some general tips, poetry resources, etc. Or we can look at questions, or we can maybe do both. I don't know if do we have any questions there in the chat? Don't think so at the moment. So
So,
no. Okay, if you do have a question, pop it in there now, and we'll just carry on conversing for the moment, Don. Any general tips, things that we'd like to leave people with in terms of preparing for submission?
yeah, I mean, let me see. I suppose there was that kind of aspect of maybe keeping track of your submissions. You can often, can't you? I found I used to sort of send things off to a few different places, and then once I had things accepted in two places at once, and then it was kind of embarrassing what to do at that point. Um, but that's probably a good problem to have. So maybe you shouldn't worry too much about that. But yeah, I think that you sort of have to start to keep an administrative check on yourself, don't you, when you start putting things into places as a poet?
Definitely do. Yeah, yeah. Just for in terms too of when competitions open and close, or submission windows open and
Yeah.
close. There is a bit of administration that goes along with your practice. So I think it is good practice to keep track of all of that. What I would do, I don't have a spreadsheet, but I have just a Word document that I keep changing depending on which poem. I just keep track of what poems I've sent where, as you're saying there,
Mhm.
and uh, keeping the dates in a calendar or a diary, so that I usually put them like 3 or 4 days ahead of the close of a submission window or a competition,
Yeah.
because if you leave it right to the last minute, sometimes you're busy with something and you've missed it. But if it's in mind 3 or 4 days ahead, you'll definitely meet that deadline.
Yeah.
So that's maybe a little tip. Um, and also, we all get lots of rejections, and I think one good tip is just not to get upset about that. Just keep writing and sending things out.
Yeah.
It's everybody says I've enough rejection letters to wallpaper my study, and it's true. We'll all get those all the time. I just, again, to go back to our first point, I think today, enjoy the process, learn from the process of writing, submitting, being part of a community, and don't worry too much about rejection, and be pleased if you do be
Yeah.
successful in getting something published in a journal or win
Mm.
an award. The real meaning of it, I think, is the writing itself and the kind of
Yeah.
things we've been talking about in terms of immersing in that element, whether it's destructive or not. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
I know, and it's like the
so
more
those would be
poets you
some.
talk to, the more that you know that everyone's being rejected. Everyone's constantly being rejected for something. It's just impossible to be right for everything, whatever that even means. It's just one of those things.
Yeah. And it's those sorts of things, like rejections are not always about, or even ever, about the quality of the writing, really. There's
No.
so many people submitting these days to journals and competitions. The numbers themselves make it, the odds quite long that you will be successful. So when you are, it is cause for celebration. But it can be just the difference in editorial taste. And I think that's why journals quite frequently change their editors. For example, Poetry Ireland has a different editor for every issue, which means that, if your work wasn't to the taste of one, it just might be to the taste of the next editor. So just keep sending things out and building up a portfolio that way. Yeah.
But and on a there is
Um,
there
do
is that preference element
you-
that always inevitably would come into anything, but there's just a very good chance that if you're just ticking the boxes on a craft level and you're doing the kind of the things that the bones of good writing, that you're likely to head towards the long list. You're likely to sort of, push over into that end of things. Um, and it's just sometimes those particular poems that have a little bit of magic about them that are the things that tip them into being the winners. But it's yeah, but yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Was there anything else? Any other general? There's something in the chat there.
oh,
Lulu, is it? Hello. Just recommending Margaret O'Brien's Bag of Stars. Writing every morning for 4 days next week from 7 a.m. to 8 a.m. It's as much time as I can give, works for me once a month. And there's an email address, margaretwriting@gmail.com. So what is that, Lulu? Do you want to unmute maybe?
Sorry, not allowing participants to unmute. Okay. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
yes.
Grand. Okay, yeah, it's just I've done it actually I did it last year when I was away in the States for 3 months, and it's a great practice because you meet online, you meet a group of people, there's a trigger of some sort, and you don't have to follow the trigger, you can do your own work or anything else. But for me it's like a kind of a date, that I do an hour. And like it's as much as I can give. It's an hour before I normally wake up, so it's perfect for me that I get up an hour earlier just to do this hour devoted to something to do with writing. And in a lot of cases, you come up with, editing something or even writing something new, something from the trigger sometimes as well. But I just find it's pretty cheap for. I know she's only just pushing you to do the thing, but I find I need practice like that. I need workshops and as much contact with people to give myself a shove to keep going forward.
Thanks very much. That's amazing.
Yeah,
Yep.
it's good. Yeah. I think we were just going to finish off with saying a couple of words about recommendations, poetry resources that people may or may not be aware of.
Hmm.
So I've mentioned Poetry Ireland, but if you go to their website, poetryireland.ie, they connect poets, they list opportunities for writers on a regular basis. So that's definitely worth checking out. There's also the Irish Writers Centre, irishwriterscentre.ie. They have courses, mentoring, workshops, residencies are noted there. So if you're, this is an important part of your practice too, is again, as I was saying, just to be aware of what's going on out there. So those two, Poetry Ireland, Irish Writers Centre. Online, there's the UCD, the University College Dublin Irish Poetry Reading Archive. That's available through YouTube, and you can listen to various Irish and international poets reading their work and talking about their work there. There's Mislexia, which is a magazine, but it publishes lists of submission windows and awards and events. So it's what's the address there? Oh, I don't think I have the address there, but it's Mslexia, Mislexia. That you could just Google that and find their web page. I also get to my inbox every day a poem per day from their various what's the right word, platforms or organizations that do this, like Poetry Daily, Poem a Day, The Slowdown. They give you a poem, but some of them also give like a commentary on the poem or have the poet speak, having written a little bit about their poem. And those can be useful daily practices to go and just, acquaint yourself with a new writer, remember a writer that you'd forgotten about, or read the commentary that the poet has given. And I'll be quiet in a moment, but just I'm a really big radio fan. So there's a great program on Radio 3 called The Verb, which is presented by Ian McMillan, and he often talks about poetry and interviews poets, as well as, Radio 4 has some great poetry programs from time to time. Radio Ulster as well. Dawn, you've been on recently. I know you maybe want to talk about that, but those are my sort of recommendations for resources, I suppose.
Was that called The Verb with a B, The Verb?
The verb as in
Verb.
VERB.
Yeah, it just made me think of another sort of hint that sort of tip that I always think of with poetry is that sometimes poems can just be too much in our heads and images can be too imagey, and not forgetting your verbs, putting active verbs in every sort of line in your poem in some way that you're making things happen, that you're not just linking together a series of observations. But yeah, in terms of tips, yeah, I really love the poetryfoundation.org. I always find things on there. I was reading an essay the other day with my undergrad students called Learning the Poetic Line by Rebecca Hazelden. And, there's lots of essays just on form and on craft that, yeah, I just go back to all the time. But yeah.
And not to forget books as well. I mean, there are many essays and books in which poets, writers more generally, have reflected on their practice. The essay Why I Write by George Orwell is always a good touchstone, although it's quite a few years old now. And likewise, Joan Didion's response to that, also called Why I Write. When I was teaching creative writing, I always used to start the semester by having students write a little statement, why I write, and then have them revisit that in week 12 at the end of the semester and see how things had changed across the course. So that's something you could do for yourselves is just write a paragraph trying to articulate your reasons for writing, but also your poetics. What's your practice about? How do you see poetry working for you? It's just a way of, I think, thinking through and articulating what writing means to you.
Yeah.
There are many other books. I mean, we could go on and on. Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird, Terence Hayes' Watch Your Language. But keep an eye out for those kind of writings, which are writing about writing, I suppose, which is always very instructive, I find, to
Yeah.
engage with that kind of work.
Richard Hugo's book, The Triggering Town, is a lovely book as well. I really, really enjoy on the craft of poetry. And then I guess there's Mary
What's it
Oliver.
called?
It's
The
called
Triggering.
The Triggering Town. And the writer is Richard Hugo.
Yeah.
It's a really it's quite a slim book, but it's a lovely book on craft and yeah, sort of inspiration, this idea of us all having a triggering town in some sense, and it's good.
Very good. Yeah. Okay, I didn't know of that one. Yeah.
Mm.
Okay. Well, I suppose we're at our time limit, are we?
Yeah, I think we are.
It goes very quickly when you start talking and engaging and thinking these things through. So thank you all for taking the time to attend today, to take part in the workshop. I hope it's been useful. It's been useful for me listening to Dawn. I know that it always is, and sort of reignites some ideas and things I might try myself. So thanks, Dawn, and good luck to each of you. We look forward to reading your work, and do submit.
Yeah, just want to say thanks very much, Kathleen, too. This is like a favorite part of my year, getting to sort of interact with Kathleen and talk about poems. So
Yeah.
yeah, so do enter and enter your poems, send them to us. We actually are genuinely find it exciting and fun to do. So yeah, look forward to it.
Okay, thanks, Dawn.